Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Talmage of Love of Christ Lutheran Church in Mesa, Arizona. Each week, Pastor Nanette Christofferson and I seek to provide a brief introduction to two of the assigned Bible readings for the upcoming Sunday. In this video, we're going to look at the Old Testament reading assigned for Sunday, July 11, 2021. It's from the prophet Amos, chapter 7, verses 7 to 15. Background from the study Bible, Lutheran Study Bible, indicates that Amos declared he was not a prophet, but a farmer who raised sheep and tended fig trees. Amos's prophecies date to the first half of the 8th century before Common Era, making him one of the earliest of the prophets whose writings appear in the Bible. Amos was active as a prophet during the king of Uzziah, 783 to 742 BCE, of the southern kingdom, Judah, and King Jeroboam, 786 to 746 BCE, of the northern kingdom, Israel. Though Amos was from Tekoa, about 10 miles south of Jerusalem, he seems to have prophesied mainly in Bethel, one of the royal sanctuaries of the northern kingdom. It was located about 11 miles north of Jerusalem. Though Amos never mentions the Assyrians by name, he warned that the northern kingdom would be judged on the dark day of the Lord and that the people would be taken into exile beyond Damascus. Amos's prophecies came to pass when the Assyrians defeated Israel and captured its capital, Samaria, in 722 BCE. Amos wanted to invite the 10 northern tribes of Israel back into the communion with their God, Yahweh, and with their two southern brothers, Judah and Benjamin. The northern tribes of Israel disrupted the brotherhood that existed under the reign of Kings David and Solomon. In 921 BCE, after the death of Solomon, the northern tribes worshipped in the wrong places, such as Samaria and Bethel, using rituals regarded as improper by the two southern tribes. Judahite interpreters from the southern tribes blamed the north and its leaders for the broken relationship. They pointed to the northerners' rebellious spirit, which was fueled by the polluting influence of Canaanite and Phoenician politics and religion. The worship of other gods in addition to Yahweh was a severe offense. Also mentioned frequently was the issue of economic inequality. The mistreatment of the poor and disenfranchised was a key offense. Southerners accused the Northerners of abandoning their shared core value, equality among siblings, based in their equality before God. The book of Amos can be outlined as follows. There's an introduction, verses 1 and 2 of chapter 1. There are oracles condemning Judah, Israel, and the neighboring nations, chapter 1, verse 3 through chapter 2, verse 16. Oracles against Israel, chapter 3, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 14. And then visions of judgment, chapter 7, verse 1 through chapter 9, verse 10. And vision of a restored kingdom, chapter 9, verses 11 to 15. Amos clearly announces God's concern for justice. Properly observing worship practices, festivals, and sacrifices had little meaning if the peoples did not treat others with justice and righteousness. Even though the people of the northern kingdom lived in a time that was relatively peaceful and prosperous, they used their wealth for personal comforts, not to help others. Unfair business practices and oppressive taxes that squeezed the poor were common. Poverty and landlessness were conditions that never should have come to exist in ancient Israel and Judah. The land, the visible sign of God's presence and promise, was a trust from God for the sake of all Israel and Judah. Laws and customs described in Leviticus and Deuteronomy prohibited the accumulation of land and goods in ways that would impoverish a fellow descendant of Abraham and Sarah. Regular land redistribution was a part of the ideal religious landscape. The message of Amos is a challenge to people and nations caught up in the pursuit of material wealth and comfort. Societies driven by consumerism can lose sight of faithful stewardship of wealth and the just distribution of goods. Amos reminded the people that true faithfulness is trusting in God alone and treating the neighbor with justice. The context for Amos chapter 7. We read in chapter 6 these highlights. The wealthy, elite, and influential of Israel lounge around, eating and drinking the finest money can buy, but don't pay any attention to the coming ruin. They have corrupted justice into poison, using power and influence for personal or self-interest gain, and they've turned the fruit of righteousness into bitter-tasting wormwood. They assumed that King Jeroboam's victories were the result of their own strength rather than God's. God is at work raising up a nation against their pride, hubris, and disregard for building the blessed and beloved community to which they were called. Leading into our reading, chapter 7, verses 1 to 9, we hear words of judgment. God is forming locusts just in time to devour the harvest, verse 1. God is calling forth a shower of fire, verse 4. God shows Amos a plumb line and offers a promise that high places, sanctuaries, and the house of Jeroboam will fall, verses 7 through 9. After these words spoken by Amos, we shift to the royal court of Jeroboam and his advisors. The key advisor is Amaziah in verse 10, the priest of the sanctuary at Bethel. He reports in verse 11, "For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile and away from his land." How would you receive such words, particularly when you seem to be in a position of a conquering king and there's relative peace and prosperity in your land? Verse 12, Amaziah said to Amos, "O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah, earn your bread there and prophesy there." Verse 13, "But never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it's the temple of the kingdom." Why is our initial reaction to words that we don't want to hear defensiveness? Or whoever is sharing such words, we just wish they would go away. Notice Amaziah is justifying his desire to censor and banish Amos by reminding Amos whose sanctuary he is standing. The irony here is the only God specifically instructed his people to build was the one in Jerusalem, not Bethel. Plus, when we begin to think it is so and so sanctuary, or even our own, we have failed to understand who ultimately the owner is and who is to be our focus for our worship in that place. Verse 14, "And Amos answered Amaziah, I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, Go and prophesy to my people Israel." Amos makes it clear that he is not a professional prophet, a member of the Prophets Guild, or following in the line of his ancestors. He is not on anyone's payroll. He's a man of the field and flocks who God interrupted his life and his routine to call him to speak a hard but a crucial word to a part of God's family, hoping that word might cause the leader, King Jeroboam, and his cohort to turn the tribes of Israel back to the worship of Yahweh and working to bring healing to the nation that has been divided between north and south. not a part of our reading, but the conclusion of the chapter reinforces the difficult but serious word of judgment Amos presents. Listen to verses 16 and 17. Now therefore, hear the word of the Lord. You say, do not prophesy against Israel, and do not preach against the house of Isaac. Therefore, thus says the Lord, your wife shall become a prostitute in the city, and your sons and your daughters shall fall by the sword, and your land shall be parceled out by line. You yourself shall die in an unclean land, and Israel shall surely go into exile away from its land. There are always consequences when a nation or an individual chooses to ignore the words of God, the words God has clearly spoken, either in written form or through the voice of the prophet. We need to understand that the motivation for God to call Amos was God's love for the 10 tribes that made up the northern kingdom of Israel. The first commandment is still the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. Whenever a nation puts military might and material prosperity before the care of the people who make up that nation, there are consequences. Amos and many of the prophets during this time constantly reminded God's people to practice justice or fairness and righteousness, which work to provide daily bread, shelter, and opportunity for all within the land. Tough words from Amos, but ancient words that can apply to today. God bless you on your journey.